Julian Crane signed the severance papers at 11:47 p.m., ending 36 years of building empires, and his hand didn't shake once. What made his hand shake was the woman standing in the corner of the boardroom, Elena Voss, the sculptor, Caroline's best friend, the woman he'd been in love with for 23 years while married to someone else. She wasn't supposed to be there, wasn't supposed to know he'd lost everything, wasn't supposed to look at him like she finally understood what he'd been hiding all along. "You came," he said. "Your wife asked me to." Elena's voice was steady. "Before she died, she made me promise that when this happened, when you finally lost, I'd be here to catch you." The papers slipped from his hands. Because Caroline had known, had always known, and she'd orchestrated this moment from the grave. Stay, because what Caroline knew, what she'd been protecting them from, is something neither Julian nor Elena can survive alone. Have you ever loved someone you weren't allowed to want? Drop a comment. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. This story doesn't start with an ending. It starts 4 months earlier with a photograph that wasn't supposed to exist. The photograph appeared on the front page of the Arts and Culture section, then Vanity Fair, then everywhere. Julian Crane's hand resting on Elena Voss's shoulder in her studio, both of them caught in profile, her fingers still clay-stained, his expression unreadable. The caption called it a tender moment between the reclusive billionaire and the artist immortalizing his late wife's memory. Tender. The word made Elena's stomach turn. She hadn't seen Julian in 3 years, not since Caroline's funeral, where he'd stood at the grave like a man carved from the same marble he'd later commissioned Elena to sculpt. Before that, it had been nearly 2 decades of dinners and museum openings and late-night phone calls, the kind of friendship that existed in the margins of marriages, in the safety of other people's vows. And now the world thought they were falling in love. The commission was straightforward. Julian had appeared at her studio 6 weeks earlier, unannounced, which is how he did most things that mattered. No assistant, no security detail visible, though Elena knew they were there. Just Julian at 61, still lean and severe in the way of men who channeled grief into control, his salt and pepper hair shorter than she remembered. "I need you to create something for Caroline," he'd said, not quite meeting his eyes, "for the sculpture garden at the foundation. Something that captures—" He stopped, started again. "You knew her. You'll know what to make." Elena had known Caroline Westfield Crane for 23 years, had watched her marry Julian when Elena herself was still married to Michael, back when the 4 of them spent weekends in the Hamptons pretending their lives weren't slowly calcifying into beautiful, hollow things. Caroline had been the warm one, the one who remembered birthdays and asked about your mother's health. Julian had been the brilliant one, the one who built empires in renewable energy while barely speaking at dinner parties. And Elena had been the observer, the one who sculpted other people's lives because her own had never quite taken shape. "I'll do it," she'd said, because she owed Caroline that much, because Julian looked like he might shatter if she said no, because her last commission had been 18 months ago, and the galleries were starting to forget her name. They shook hands like strangers. The contract arrived the next day. $300,000, 6 months to completion, full creative control, a clause about discretion that Elena barely read. She should have read it. The paparazzi photograph changed everything. Julian's publicist, a woman named Margot with the warmth of brushed steel, called within an hour of publication. "We need to talk about optics," she said, which was never a sentence that ended well. The meeting happened at Julian's penthouse, the kind of space that made you aware of how much air you displaced. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, art that belonged in museums.
silence that cost millions to maintain. Margot had laid out the situation with clinical precision. Julian's company, Crane Meridian, was facing a hostile takeover attempt led by a hedge fund that specialized in hostile takeovers. The narrative they were pushing, Julian Crane, the grieving widower, is too emotionally compromised to lead, unreliable, living in the past. The photograph, Margot said, sliding her tablet across the table, is currently our biggest problem and our best opportunity. Elena looked at Julian. He was standing by the window, hands in his pockets, the posture of a man enduring. "I don't understand," Elena said. "The problem," Margot continued, "is that it suggests Julian is moving on inappropriately fast. Caroline's been gone 14 months. The optics are grotesque," Julian said quietly. "She's going to say grotesque." "Complicated," Margot corrected. "But here's the opportunity. If this is a romance, if Julian Crane is rebuilding his life with someone who knew and loved Caroline, someone age-appropriate, someone with gravitas, that's not moving on too fast. That's healing. That's a man who's emotionally stable, forward-thinking, ready to lead." Elena felt something cold settle in her chest. "You want us to pretend we're together. I want you to be seen together. Dinners, the memorial gala next month, a few carefully placed photographs. Let the narrative build itself. By the time the shareholder vote happens in January, Julian won't be the broken widower. He'll be the man who found a second chance." "No," Elena said immediately. $2 million in addition to the commission fee for 4 months of public appearances. Elena stood. "I'm not for sale." "Everyone's for sale. The only question is whether the price matches the indignity." "Margot," Julian's voice cut through the room. He turned from the window, and Elena saw something in his expression she couldn't name. "Leave us." Margot gathered her things with the efficiency of someone accustomed to being dismissed. The door closed behind her with a sound like a vault ceiling. Julian poured 2 glasses of scotch without asking, handed one to Elena. They drank in silence, the way they used to at Caroline's endless charity functions, finding refuge in the corners of ballrooms. "I'm not asking you to do this," Julian said finally. "Yes, you are. I'm asking you to consider it. It's obscene, Julian. We were Caroline's friends, both of us." "Were?" The word hung in the air. "When did we stop being?" Elena looked at him then, really looked. The lines around his eyes had deepened. There was a tightness to his jaw that spoke of nights without sleep. He looked like a man holding himself together through sheer force of will. "When she died," Elena said softly. "We stopped being anything when she died. Maybe that's the problem." The silence stretched. Outside, the city glittered with indifference. "Why me?" Elena asked. "You could have anyone. Someone younger, more—" "I don't want anyone," Julian said, setting down his glass. "I want someone who remembers what I was before all this. Someone who won't look at me like I'm a portfolio to manage. We haven't spoken in 3 years. Whose fault is that?" The question landed like an accusation. Elena felt her throat tighten. After Caroline's funeral, after the reception where everyone said empty things about time and healing, Julian had called Elena once, then twice, then a dozen times over 3 months. Elena had let every call go to voicemail, had told herself it was respect for Caroline's memory, had known even then that it was cowardice, because grief had a way of stripping things bare, and what Elena had felt standing at Caroline's grave, watching Julian's silent devastation, wasn't friendship. It was something she'd spent 20 years not naming. 4 months, Julian said. That's all I'm asking. We attend events together. We let people believe what they want to believe. In January, after the vote, we quietly end things, mutual decision, amicable. You go back to your work, I go back to mine. And if people get hurt? Who's left to hurt? The bitterness in his voice was startling. "Caroline's gone. Your ex-husband is remarried. We're both alone, Elena. At least this way the loneliness serves a purpose." Elena looked at the sculpture garden below, where bronze and marble figures stood in permanent conversation. Static, safe, exactly what she'd spent her life creating. "I need to think about it," she said. Julian nodded. "You have until Monday." She left without finishing her drink. Elena didn't sleep that night. She sat in her studio, surrounded by half-finished sculptures and sketches for Caroline's memorial, and tried to remember when things had shifted, when Julian Crane had stopped being her friend's brilliant, difficult husband and become something else, an ache, a possibility, a door she'd never let herself open. Maybe it was the night at the Met Gala 15 years ago when Michael had been too drunk to notice Julian's hand steadying her as they walked through the Temple of Dender, the way his fingers had stayed on her elbow a moment too long. Maybe it was the winter Caroline was sick with pneumonia and Julian had called Elena at 2 in the morning, not because he needed anything, but because he couldn't bear the silence in Elena Hearn's new room. They'd talked for 3 hours about nothing. Art, music, the way light changed in winter. She'd never told Caroline about that call. Or maybe it had always been there from the first dinner party where Julian had looked at one of Elena's sculptures and said, "You make loneliness beautiful," and she'd understood that he saw things other people missed.
But Caroline had been alive then. Caroline, who'd introduced them, who'd loved them both, who'd never suspected that some friendships exist because they're safe, because the boundaries are clear and the danger is theoretical. Until it's not. Elena's phone buzzed, a text from her daughter, Isabel, who lived in Portland and called every Sunday out of duty rather than affection. Saw the article. "Mom, what are you doing?" Elena stared at the message. What was she doing? Isabel was 32, married to a software engineer, living the kind of stable life Elena had never managed to build. She'd been 12 when Elena and Michael divorced, old enough to take sides, young enough to never forgive. "Working," Elena typed back. "It's a commission." "It looks like more than that." "It's not." But her finger hovered over the send button, because it could be. That was the thing that terrified her. 4 months of pretending, and she might forget it was pretense. She deleted the message, wrote instead, "I'll call you Sunday." Then she turned off her phone and went back to the clay. Monday morning, Elena called Margot. "I'll do it," she said, "but I have conditions." "I'm listening." "No photographers in the studio. Julian can visit for the commission work, but my space stays private. And I want final approval on any statement or press release that mentions my name." "Agreed. Anything else?" "Yes." Elena's voice hardened. "If at any point this feels exploitative of Caroline's memory, I'm out. I don't care about the money or the contract. I walk." There was a pause. "I'll draft an addendum. Julian will want to speak with you himself. Tell him I'll see him Thursday. The Met is doing a retrospective on Rodin. We used to go together, all 4 of us." "Perfect," Margot said. "I'll have a photographer there. Coincidentally, of course." Of course. The Rodin retrospective was everything Elena remembered and nothing she expected. Julian arrived precisely on time, dressed in charcoal wool and the kind of understated watch that cost more than most cars. He looked at her the way he always had, with a focus that made her feel simultaneously seen and studied. "You came," he said. "I had an agreement. I meant to the exhibition. You didn't have to choose this." But she had, because if they were going to lie to the world, she wanted to start with something true. They had loved these sculptures once, the 4 of them, standing in front of the Kiss and the gates of hell,
arguing about passion and damnation and whether art could redeem suffering. They moved through the galleries in silence, the photographer a discreet shadow 20 feet behind. Other visitors recognized Julian. She saw the double takes, the whispered conversations, but no one approached. That was the thing about enormous wealth. It created a force field of "don't disturb." They stopped in front of the thinker. "Do you remember what Caroline said about this one?" Julian asked quietly. Elena did. "That's every man I've ever known, sitting alone with his thoughts, convinced he's solving the world's problems while life happens around him." She was right, Elena said. She usually was. They stood there, not touching, and Elena became aware of how much space existed between them. 18 inches, a canyon. The photographer's shutter clicked somewhere in the background. "This isn't going to work," Elena said, still looking at the sculpture. "People will see through it." "Through what?" "The performance. We don't look like people in love. We look like people at a museum." Julian turned to her then. "What do people in love look like?" "I don't know. Less careful." Something shifted in his expression. Without warning, he reached up and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear. His fingers brushed her cheekbone. The touch lasted maybe 2 seconds, but Elena felt it like an electrical current. "Better?" he asked, his voice low. Elena couldn't speak. Because it wasn't better, it was dangerous. It was the difference between playing a part and forgetting you were acting. The photographer's shutter clicked again. Julian's hand dropped. "Dinner?" he asked, as if nothing had happened. "Where?" "Somewhere will be seen." Which is how Elena found herself at Le Bernardin, sitting across from Julian Crane in a corner booth that somehow felt both public and intimate. The restaurant was the kind of place where conversations happened in low voices and every table pretended not to notice every other table. They ordered without looking at the menu. Muscle memory from dozens of dinners with Caroline and Michael back when their lives were simpler, or at least differently complicated. "Tell me about the sculpture." "For Caroline," Julian said after the wine arrived. Elena hesitated. She'd been working on sketches, but nothing felt right. How do you capture someone who existed in gestures rather than grand moments? Caroline was the person who remembered you liked your coffee light, who sent handwritten notes after dinner parties, who cried at pharmaceutical commercials and pretended it was allergies. "I'm thinking about hands," Elena said finally. "The way she used them when she talked, always reaching, connecting. She never let silence calcify into distance." Julian was quiet for a long moment. "She would have loved that you noticed." "I noticed everything about her." "I know." He turned his wine glass, watching the light refract through burgundy. "That's why I asked you. You saw her the way I did, as someone whole, not just as someone's wife." The words hung between them, weighted with things unsaid. Their food arrived. They ate slowly, the way people do when the meal is an excuse rather than the point. Around them, the restaurant hummed with wealth and discretion. Elena caught someone at the bar taking a photograph with their phone. Let them, she thought. This was the job. "Your daughter texted me," Julian said surprisingly. "Isabel?" "She wanted to know if I was taking advantage of you." He smiled slightly. She used more colorful language. "I'm sorry, she's protective." "She's right to be." Julian set down his fork. "I am taking advantage of your talent, your history with Caroline, your loneliness, all of it." "That's honest." "I'm too old for anything else." "You're 61. That's not old." "It is in some ways." He looked at her directly. "I'm old enough to know what I've lost, young enough to feel every day of it." "I understand." She was 56, divorced for 16 years, estranged from her daughter, successful in a field that valued youth above all else. Her body ached in ways it didn't a decade ago. Her hands trembled sometimes when she worked. Time was no longer theoretical. "What do you miss most?" she asked. "About Caroline." Julian considered this. The way she used to read in bed. Nothing important, gardening magazines, mystery novels, but she'd read me the ridiculous parts out loud. I'd be working on my laptop, pretending not to listen, and she'd read me a sentence about hydrangeas or a particularly bad plot twist, and we'd both laugh. He paused. "I miss laughing." Elena's throat tightened, because she remembered that Julian, the one who'd laughed at Caroline's running commentary, who'd been softer in the margins of his marriage, who'd let his guard down in his own home. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be. It's not your fault she died." But the way he said it made Elena wonder if he blamed someone, maybe himself, the doctors who missed the aneurysm until it was too late, God, if he believed in such things. Grief needed a target, and sometimes the only available one is yourself. The check came. Julian paid without looking at it. They walked out into the October cold, and this time when the photographers appeared, 3 of them, cameras ready, Julian's hand found the small of Elena's back with practiced ease. "Smile or don't, grief is part of the story," he murmured. Elena didn't smile. She let herself be guided to the car, let Julian open the door, let the flashbulbs capture what they wanted. And when he slid in beside her and the privacy screen went up, she finally asked the question that had been building all evening. "Why didn't you call me after Caroline died? You called for 3 months, and then nothing." Julian looked out the window at Manhattan sliding past. "You stopped answering." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have." "You stopped answering, and I understood. Some doors close for good reasons. I wasn't going to be the man who forced one open." "And now?" "Now we're pretending it never was closed." The car stopped outside her building in Soho. Before Elena could reach for the door, Julian caught her hand. "Thank you," he said, "for tonight, for all of this." His thumb brushed across her knuckles, and Elena felt a 20 years of careful distance collapse into a single point of contact. "It's just a job," she said, not believing it. "Of course," Julian agreed, not believing it.
She pulled her hand away and stepped out into the night. "Comment right now. Forgiven or betrayed? That's all, one word, because this is where everything changes." The next 6 weeks developed a rhythm that felt less like pretense and more like archaeology, carefully excavating a friendship that had been buried alive. Julian came to the studio twice a week, ostensibly to check on Caroline's memorial. But he'd stay for hours, sitting in the corner with his laptop, working while Elena sculpted. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. The silence between them lost its edges. She learned things she'd never known. That he'd wanted to be a concert pianist before his father died and left him a company to save. That he still played late at night when he couldn't sleep, though he'd sold Caroline Steinway because the muscle memory of her absence was too strong. That he'd loved Caroline deeply, but not, he admitted this one night over Chinese takeout in the studio, in the way people wrote poems about. "We were partners," he said, picking at lo mein with chopsticks. "Best friends. We built a life together that was good and true and meaningful. But it wasn't consuming," Elena finished. "Yes." He looked at her. "Is that terrible to say?" "No, it's honest." "Caroline knew. We talked about it once, years ago. She said some loves keep you warm, and some loves burn you alive. And she was grateful. Ours was the former." Julian set down his chopsticks. "She said she'd had the burning kind once in college. It had nearly destroyed her." Elena thought about her own marriage. Michael had been handsome, charming, unfaithful in small ways that accumulated into chasms. Their divorce had then civilized. They divided assets and custody with the efficiency of people who never quite learned each other's languages. I've never had that, the burning kind. Maybe you're lucky. Maybe. But she didn't feel lucky. She felt like she'd spent her entire life in the safe shallows, never diving deep enough to drown. The memorial gala happened on a Friday in November. Elena wore black, Caroline's favorite color, though she'd always claimed it was classic rather than morbid. The dress was simple, elegant, with a high neck and long sleeves. Age-appropriate, Margot had said approvingly, which made Elena want to show up in something backless and completely inappropriate. Julian picked her up himself, no driver. He wore a tuxedo the way some men wore armor. "You look beautiful," he said when she slid into the car. "You look terrified." "I am." He pulled into traffic. 300 people are going to spend the evening watching me mourn my wife while pretending to date her best friend. It's obscene. We can still cancel. No, we can't. He was right. The gala was the centerpiece of Margot's strategy, a chance to show Julian as a man honoring his past while embracing his future. The guest list included major shareholders, board members, and enough society reporters to fill a tabloid for months. The venue was the Frick Collection because Caroline loved it there. Elena and Julian arrived separately, but were seated together at the head table, close enough that their shoulders touched when they shifted. All night people approached with condolences and congratulations in equal measure, as if death and new romance occupied the same emotional register. "I'm so glad Julian has you. Caroline would have wanted this." Would she? Elena wasn't sure anymore. Caroline was generous, but there were limits to what anyone could forgive. And this, whatever this was becoming, might exceed them. Dinner was salmon and platitudes. Speeches were made about Caroline's foundation work, her commitment to education, her grace. Julian sat rigid through all of it, his hand resting on the table inches from Elena's. She wanted to reach for him, and knew she couldn't. Not yet. The performance had its own timeline. Then came the tribute video. Caroline laughing at a charity event. Caroline cutting a ribbon at a school opening. Caroline and Julian at their wedding day, impossibly young, impossibly hopeful. The footage was 23 years old, and Julian's face then was softer, unlined, almost vulnerable. Elena watched Julian watching his wife, saw the muscle in his jaw tighten, saw his hand curl into a fist on the tablecloth. Without thinking, she covered at hers. His fingers opened, interlaced with hers, held on like she was the only solid thing in a room full of ghosts. The video ended. The lights came up. Applause rippled through the ballroom, and Julian Crane, billionaire, philanthropist, master of self-control, stood and excused himself with a grace that fueled everyone except Elena. She found him 10 minutes later in the sculpture garden, standing in front of a Rodin bronze, his shoulders rigid with the effort of not breaking. "Julian, I can't do this." His voice was raw. "Every person in that room is looking at us and thinking I've dishonored her memory. And they're right. No, they're not. Yes, they are." He turned to Elena. "Because it stopped being fake somewhere between the museum and tonight, and we both know it." The words hung in the cold November air. Elena should have denied it, should have reminded him about the contract, the timeline, the January endpoint, should have done anything except step closer and say, "I know." "When?" Julian asked. "When did it stop being pretend for you?"
I don't know. Maybe it never was. He stared at Elena. Elena, don't. Elena held up a hand. Don't say whatever you're about to say. We have 4 more weeks. We finish this, we honor the agreement, and then we figure out what's real. What if I can't wait 4 weeks? You have to. Why? Because I'm terrified. Because if we cross this line now, before the contract ended, it'll contaminate everything. We'll never know if this is grief seeking comfort or something that could survive daylight. Because Caroline deserves better than us using her memory as foreplay, Elena said harshly. Julian flinched, but he nodded. You're right. They stood in the garden, surrounded by sculptures of people who'd been dead for centuries and did not touch. The photograph from that night, Julian and Elena in the garden, close but not touching, both of them caught in profile with expressions of raw need, became the image everyone remembered. It was on the cover of 3 magazines. It was analyzed by body language experts. It was everything Margot had wanted. And it destroyed them both in different ways. Because pretending became impossible after that. December arrived with the kind of cold that made Manhattan feel brittle. Julian stopped coming to the studio. He texted excuses, board meetings, conference calls, emergencies that required his immediate attention. Elena understood. We'd gotten too close. The garden was a warning shot. I threw myself into Caroline's memorial, worked 16-hour days until her hands cramped and her vision blurred. The sculpture was taking shape. 2 hands, reaching toward each other but not quite touching, cast in bronze. There was something unbearable about it. Her daughter called on a Tuesday night. Mom, we need to talk. I'm busy, Isabel. Elena pressed the phone between her shoulder and ear, still working clay. Too busy to tell me you're in love with Julian Crane? Elena's hand stilled. What? The photos, Mom. The way you look at him. I'm not an idiot. It's complicated. It's always complicated with you. Isabel's voice carried an old bitterness. You couldn't make it work with Dad, but you can play house with your dead friend's husband? That's not fair. None of this is fair. Caroline was good to us. She said birthday cards every year after you and Dad split. She came to my college graduation when you couldn't make it because of some gallery opening in Prague. And now you're, what, replacing her? I'm not replacing anyone. Then what are you doing? Elena looked at the sculpture before her. Caroline's hands, forever reaching. I don't know, she admitted. I truly don't know. Isabel was quiet for a moment. I can't watch you do this. I can't watch you build something on top of someone else's grave. Elena, but the line was already dead. Elena set down the phone, looked at her clay-stained hands, thought about all the things she'd sculpted and all the things she never had the courage to touch. She called Julian at midnight. I need to see you, she said when he answered. Elena, I don't think... Please. 30 minutes later, he was at her door. They didn't speak first. Julian stood in her studio, still in work clothes, looking at Caroline's nearly finished memorial. Elena watched him process it. The reaching, the gap, the intimacy of hands that almost touched. It's perfect, he said finally. It's unfinished. Some things should be. He turned to Elena. Why did you call? Elena had rehearsed this, had planned to tell him about Isabel's call, about her doubts, about the need to maintain boundaries until January. But looking at him now, in her space, surrounded by her work, she couldn't remember why those things mattered. I'm tired of pretending, she said. Pretending what? That this is just a job, that you're just Caroline's husband, that I've been lying to myself for 20 years about what I felt every time you walked into a room.
Julian went very still. Don't. Don't what? Tell the truth? Don't make this about something that happened before. We were married to other people. We were loyal. I know. I was so loyal, I stopped answering your calls because I couldn't trust myself to keep being loyal. Elena moved closer. After Caroline died, you called me every week. Do you know why I didn't answer? You were grieving. I was terrified because the first thought I had at her funeral wasn't about loss, it was about you, about the fact that you were finally free, and I was finally free, and maybe... She stopped, started again. That's why I didn't answer, because I was a terrible friend and an even worse person. You were human. That's not enough. Caroline deserved better. Yes, she did. Julian's voice was rough. She deserved a husband who loved her the way you're supposed to love a wife, with passion and obsession and the kind of need that makes you stupid. But I couldn't give her that, because I'd already used up that capacity on someone I could never have. The air left Elena's lungs. What are you saying? I'm saying I've been in love with you since the night we met at that gallery opening 23 years ago. You were wearing green, some silk thing, and you were arguing with Michael about Giacometti, and you were so fiercely, beautifully alive. Julian's hands clenched at his sides, and I spent the next 2 decades making sure no one knew, especially not you, especially not Caroline. Julian! She knew anyway. He said it quietly. Not at first, but eventually. She asked me about it once, maybe 10 years ago. I denied it, but she was too smart, too kind. She said she understood, that she'd rather I stay and love you from a distance than leave and destroy what we'd built. Elena felt tears on her face without realizing she was crying. Why are you telling me this now? Because you asked for the truth, and because I'm too tired to keep lying. He looked at her with 20 years of restraint finally breaking. I loved Caroline. I honored our marriage. I never touched you, never crossed a line. But that doesn't mean I didn't count every hour we spent in the same room. It doesn't mean I didn't memorize the way you gestured when you talked about art, or the way you laughed at my terrible jokes, or the way you looked at sculptures like you were seeing their souls. Stop! I can't. Not anymore. He moved toward her, and Elena should have stepped back, but couldn't. They were inches apart now. Elena could see the silver threading through his hair, the lines around his eyes, the face she'd been memorizing in fragments for decades. We can't do this, she whispered. Why not? Because it's dishonorable. Because people will say we dishonored Caroline's memory. Because my daughter already hates me for it. Because it's terrifying to finally have what you wanted when you never thought you'd get it? Yes. Julian raised a hand, hesitated,
then cupped her face with a gentleness that shattered her. "I've been terrified for 23 years. I'm tired of being scared." "The contract ends in January. We're supposed to walk away." "I know. Margot planned all of this. The photos, the narrative, the timeline. We're not real. We're a strategy." "I know that too." "Then why does this feel like the most real thing I've ever done?" Julian smiled, and it was the saddest thing Elena had ever seen. "Because maybe it is." He leaned down, stopped with his forehead against hers, giving her every chance to pull away. Elena closed her eyes, felt his breath on her lips, felt 20 years of careful distance condensing into a single moment of choice. She kissed him. Or he kissed her. Later, neither of them would be able to say who moved first. It didn't matter. What mattered was the way 2 decades of restraint collapsed into hunger, into hands tangling in hair, into bodies remembering what minds had forbidden. They broke apart, gasping. "This is a mistake," Elena said. "Probably. People will crucify us." "Let them! We're too old for this." Julian laughed, actually laughed. "That's the most absurd thing you've ever said." He kissed her again. And this time, Elena let herself drown in it, let herself forget about Isabel's judgment, Margot's strategy, the shareholders who needed a narrative. Let herself be 56 and terrified and alive in a way she hadn't been in years. When they finally pulled apart, Elena was shaking. "What do we do now?" Elena asked. "I don't know," Julian said, pressing his forehead to hers again. "But I know I'm not walking away in January, contract or no contract." "Julian, I've spent 23 years honoring everyone else's needs. Caroline's, the company's, society's expectations. I'm 61 years old, Elena. How much time do you think we have left?" The question landed like a blow, because he was right. Time wasn't theoretical anymore. It was a countdown neither of them could stop. "Stay tonight," Elena heard herself say. "Julian, just stay. We don't have to—" She stopped. "I just don't want to be alone." Julian looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Pause. Close your eyes. What's the one word you're feeling? Not thinking, feeling. Type it below. I'll read every single one." They didn't make love that night. They lay in Elena's bed, fully clothed, in the darkness of her bedroom. Julian's arm was around her shoulders. Elena's head rested against his chest. She could hear his heartbeat, steady, relentless, proof of life. "Tell me about the piano, the thing you gave up," she said quietly. So he did. He talked about Chopin and Rachmaninoff and the way music could express things language couldn't reach. He talked about his father's death when he was 25, about inheriting a struggling company and a family legacy he'd never wanted, about choosing duty over dream. "Do you regret it?" Elena asked. "I used to. Now I think regret is just another word for being alive long enough to see your choices calcify into a life. That's bleak. It's honest." Elena thought about all the sculptures she'd made, all the galleries that had shown her work, all the recognition that never quite filled the space where a life should have been. "I wasted 20 years," she said. "We both did. So what do we do now? We stop wasting them." They fell asleep like that. Two people who'd spent decades being careful, finally choosing recklessness. The scandal broke on a Monday.
Not the scandal Margot had orchestrated, the carefully managed narrative of grief transforming into new love. A different scandal entirely. Someone leaked Caroline's journal. Elena first heard about it from Margot's emergency call at 6 a.m. "We have a problem," Margot said without preamble. "Someone, likely one of the hedge fund partners, has leaked portions of Caroline's private journals to the press, the ones she wrote during her illness." Elena sat up, her heart hammering. Beside her, Julian was already awake, his face pale in the dawn light. They'd been sleeping in the same bed for 3 weeks now, though she hadn't told anyone. Not even Isabel, who still wasn't speaking to her. "What do they say?" Elena asked. "That's the problem. They vindicate everything." Margot's voice was clinical. "There are passages about Julian, about you, about the fact that Caroline knew and approved." "Approved?" "I'm sending you the excerpts. Read them, then call me back." Elena opened her email with shaking hands. The journal entries were dated 2 years before Caroline's death. October 15. "Julian thinks I don't notice, but I've always noticed. The way he looks at Elena when she's talking, like he's memorizing her. The way he volunteers us for dinners with her and Michael, even though he hates socializing. He loves her. He's loved her for years. And the terrible, beautiful thing is, I don't mind. I should mind. I should be devastated. But mostly I'm grateful, because Elena makes him soft in ways I never could. She makes him laugh. She reminds him there's more to life than quarterly earnings and legacy planning. I asked him about it once. He denied it, looked horrified that I'd even suggest it, but I saw the truth in his face, and I realized something. I would rather have Julian loving me and longing for her than have him leave me for someone who doesn't know what we built together. Is that weakness or wisdom? I can't tell anymore. March 3. Bad day. The doctors found something on the scan. Julian doesn't know yet. I'm telling him tomorrow. I keep thinking about Elena. If something happens to me, when something happens, because we're all just dying at different speeds, I hope Julian finds his way to her. I hope she says yes. I hope they stop being so goddamn noble and let themselves have whatever time is left. Love should be greedy. I learned that too late. Elena's hands were shaking so hard she nearly dropped the phone. Julian had read the same entries. His face had gone chalk white. "She knew," he said hoarsely. "The whole time. She knew and she forgave us," Elena finished, "for something we never even did." There was a long silence. Then Julian laughed, a broken, helpless sound. "We spent 20 years being honorable, and Caroline spent 20 years wishing we'd be brave." Elena felt tears streaming down her face. "What do we do?" "We honor what she actually wanted." Julian pulled her against him. "We stop apologizing for this." "The press." "Let them write what they want. I'm done performing grief for shareholders." "Margot can find another narrative." "Julian, the company can burn for all I care." He pulled back to look at her.
I'm 61 years old. I've built an empire. I've honored my vows. I've done everything that was expected of me. And I'm tired, Elena. I'm so fucking tired of doing the right thing when the right thing just means being alone. Elena thought about Isabel, about the galleries that might stop showing her work if she became too scandalous, about all the ways this could cost her. Then she thought about Caroline's words. Love should be greedy. So, okay, she said. Okay? Let's be greedy. The shareholder vote happened in January as scheduled. Julian lost. The hedge fund won control of Crane Meridian with 51% of the vote. The board forced Julian into early retirement with a generous severance package and a lifetime consulting role he had no intention of taking. The media called it a fall of grace. Margot called it a disaster. Julian called it liberation. He moved into Elena's studio 3 weeks later, bringing nothing but his clothes and a Steinway piano that barely fit through the door. "I'm too old to start over," Elena said as he watched him set up music stands in the corner she used for storage. "Good. I don't want to start over. I want to start now." The sculpture of Caroline's hands was unveiled that spring. Elena titled it Reaching, and it was immediately recognized as one of her finest works. People stood in front of it and cried. The foundation sold prints to fund scholarships. Isabel came to the unveiling and stood in front of it for 20 minutes without speaking. Afterwards, she approached Elena. "Mom?" "Isabel." They stood in awkward silence. Then Isabel said, "She loved you, Caroline. She used to tell me that you reminded her what it meant to see beauty in broken things. I didn't know you talked to her about me. I talked to her about everything. She was better at being a mother than you were." The words should have hurt. Maybe they did, but Elena understood now that some truths were just grief wearing a different mask. "I know. I'm sorry I didn't know how to be what you needed." "Are you happy? With him?" Elena thought about Julian at the piano at 3 a.m. playing Chopin nocturnes, about the way he left coffee by her workbench without asking if she wanted it, about the mornings she woke to find him sketching her while she slept. "Yes, I'm happy." Isabel nodded slowly. "Then maybe Caroline was right about you both." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was permission to stop apologizing. If this story is making you remember your own, if there's someone you waited too long for, subscribe, because there are more of us than you think, and these stories, they're ours. Julian and Elena never married. "We had our marriages," Elena said when he proposed over breakfast one Sunday. "This is something else." "What is it?" "I don't know, but it doesn't need a ceremony to be real."
They lived together in the studio, and Julian's money funded her work without expectation. She sculpted. He played piano. They grew old in the way of people who'd spent their youth being careful and their later years being reckless. There were costs. Some galleries stopped showing Elena's work, uncomfortable with the scandal. Isabel maintained her distance, polite but never warm. The business journals wrote think pieces about Julian Crane's fall from power. Society circles whispered. None of it mattered as much as they'd feared, because love in your 50s and 60s is different from love in your 20s. It's not about possibility, it's about presence. It's about looking across a room at someone who knows all your failures and choosing them anyway. It's about time running out and deciding that what you do with what's left is the only legacy that matters. 5 years after Caroline's memorial, Julian had a minor heart attack. It was survivable, treatable, but it was a warning shot. Elena sat in the hospital and held his hand and thought about all the years they'd wasted being noble. "No regrets?" Julian asked when he woke up. Elena looked at him, his silver hair, his lined face, his hands that had finally learned to reach for what they wanted instead of what they should. "None," she said. She was lying. She regretted the 20 years they'd lost, regretted not being brave enough to answer his calls after Caroline's death, regretted every dinner party where she'd sat across from him and pretended her heart wasn't fracturing. But regret and gratitude could exist in the same breath, and what she had now, this late, hard-won, greedy love, was worth every year of waiting. "Liar," Julian said, smiling. "Fine, some regrets, but not this." "Not this," he agreed. The photograph that ran with Julian's obituary 12 years later showed him at the piano in Elena's studio, his hands on the keys, his face turned towards someone outside the frame. The expression was one of absolute contentment. Elena kept that photograph on her workbench for the rest of her life. She lived another 8 years, long enough to see Isabel's first grandchild, long enough to complete a series of sculptures about aging that became her most celebrated work. But she never loved anyone after Julian. "Why would I?" she told Isabel when her daughter suggested she might date again. "I already had the real thing. Everything else would just be an echo." On her last night, pneumonia, quick and almost merciful at 84, Elena lay in her studio surrounded by decades of work. Isabel sat beside her, holding her hand. "Did it cost too much? Loving him?" Isabel asked quietly. Elena thought about Caroline's journal, about love being greedy, about how the things we regret most are usually the chances we didn't take. "It cost everything," Elena said. "It was worth it." She died 3 hours later, in the space where she had created her life's work, in the bed where Julian had slept beside her for 15 years, in the place where she'd finally learned that some loves are worth waiting for, even if the waiting nearly kills you. But that's not how this story started. This story started in a boardroom at 11:47 p.m., with Julian Crane signing away an empire and Elena Voss standing in the corner, exactly where Caroline had asked her to be. "You came," Julian had said. "Your wife asked me to, before she died. She made me promise that when this happened, when you finally lost, I'd be here to catch you." And she was. Because some promises matter more than contracts, some loves matter more than empires, and some women see everything, even from the grave, and love you anyway. One word, that's all I'm asking. What are you feeling right now? Comment it. Then subscribe if you want more stories about love that costs everything and means everything. Because we're not done yet.